One of my areas that I, kind of pride myself on is NHI communication. And some of the messages that I've received about what these craft actually are is more extra dimensional, if you will. Actually, the message that was used is I was told that you can best understand us as coming from what you would call the afterlife, which obviously that puts a pretty wild, spiritual component to this.
Best part of waking up is finding out that aliens might be coming from the afterlife in your cup. How we doing, y'all? This is going to be an interesting episode. So today we're going to be discussing a gentleman that goes by James Hodgkins. I want to make sure I get that right. And he is part of the new Skywatcher team, and with Jake Barber and these guys that are psionic assets, if you will, right? They can communicate with non-human intelligence, craft, all of this. They're bringing us disclosure in the next 12 months, right? Well, this guy did his very first interview ever, right, on Post-Disclosure World. It's a great interview. I'll put a link down in the description. Please go check it out. But we're going to be discussing one part in particular that James mentioned that I just shared there at the beginning, right? If these beings might be coming from something akin to the afterlife, what does that mean? Right. Let's dive in a little bit more to these comments. I've got 3 clips for you, so stay with me. First, let's learn a little bit more about James and his background and how he learned he had these abilities.
So, James, welcome to the show. I know that you're a member of Skywatcher. I'd like to ask a question regarding, I guess, your very earliest years. You said on X that you learned you were psychic very early on in your life. Could you go into how that played out?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, my earliest memory as a kid is of a psychic experience. I was 4 years old. I was sitting on a kitchen countertop and I fell off at just the right angle and I hit my head, broke my arm, and then I separated from my body. I can still to this day remember, basically floating above my physical form, which is on the ground crying, and just thinking, this is an odd experience. And my life going forward from there was kind of a series of, similar, strange, anomalous occurrences. And as a child, I grew up in Texas, typical kind of Protestant upbringing, and I learned that, these are not subjects that everyone necessarily wants to hear about. Things like having premonitions of my grandfather dying before he actually did. Or, there was a large wooded area behind our house where I spent a ton of time as a kid, and I would, see things out there, various spirits, land spirits, whatever you'd like to call them. And so I just, kind of internalized this as a kid. Now, on the flip side of that, I actually grew up with the UFO topic being very front and center in my life. My grandfather was an Air Force intelligence officer at Roswell. He was first sent there on TDY in 1947 from Carswell Air Force Base. He's serving under General Ramey. So the lines kind of add up there. And then my mom was actually born in Roswell in 1950. So the UFO topic has always been, perfectly acceptable in my family. And as kids typically do, you gravitate towards the other side of that. So I was always much more interested in kind of those, mystical, spiritual experiences. And mind you, this was, early 90s growing up. There wasn't the internet. I didn't have really much of a way to learn from others as to what this was. The only real resource you had back then was Barnes & Noble's New Age section, which wasn't all that complete, let's say. So just kind of had to stumble through these things and, go off to college. And in 2003, I had my first major contact experience. I was up in Middlebury, Vermont, and there was an event where I had 3 hours of missing time, and I also was physically moved about a mile from my last conscious memory. And so to this day, that's something I'm still kind of processing. But the way it presented itself, I didn't actually immediately associate that with the UFO phenomenon. I did see entities before my conscious memory, kind of went away. But I wasn't sure what to make of it. And it wasn't until many years later, as an adult, I I had a boss of mine. I told him about this experience, and he recommended Valet's Passport to Magonia. And that was the first time that I began to really understand the weirdness of all of this and kind of the interrelation between those two.
All right, so let me remind you that this is James' first ever interview. You see, again, like I mentioned before, he is part of this Skywatcher team that is claiming to be bringing us disclosure in the next 12 months, actually 11 months now. Clock is ticking. Basically sometime in 2025, right at the end of 2025, somewhere in this line, we are going to be getting disclosure from this Skywatcher team. James is part of this Skywatcher team, and a few different members are starting to come out and do their very first interviews. And we're learning about, again, this term, right, psionic, and these abilities, right, to communicate with this non-human intelligence. And James is, for the first time that I think I've heard, saying something that, you know, they're coming from the afterlife, right? Or something akin to the afterlife. Like, what does that mean exactly? Because we have our own definition of the afterlife, right? So look, let's dive into James bringing up these comments, right? And kind of trying to understand his mindset, right, as well during this experience where he got this message. And then we'll dive into a little bit more about what this afterlife message could be all about, because I have some questions.
One of my areas that I, kind of pride myself on is NHI communication. And some of the messages that I've received about what these craft actually are is more extra dimensional, if you will. Actually, the message that was used is I was told that you can best understand us as coming from what you would call the afterlife, which obviously that puts a pretty wild, spiritual component to this.
How did you receive that message? Was this during an outing where you were trying to make contact? Or was it like communicated to you telepathically?
Yes. So this was actually while we were out filming for that first Skywatcher documentary. We did a session. It was about a 2-hour session. It was a pretty long one where trying to understand these craft more directly. And actually, Dr. Gary Nolan was curious how this all worked and volunteered to kind of lead the questioning piece of, what information I could get. And that was actually there was a few interesting bits that came out of that conversation. First, I could tell we reached a point in the conversation where whatever I was interacting with seemed also to be interfered with, similarly to how the pilot was. And so I started to get very agitated. I had a lot of emotions that weren't mine, which is kind of odd in NHI communication. I don't really get a lot of emotional transference. And I could hear a voice saying basically, stop this. And that was in a lot of distress. And then the connection ended up getting severed. And this was really as we were trying to learn more about how, frankly, we can work together, how these craft operate. And so once again, there were kind of two instances where it felt like we were being interfered with.
When you received the message regarding the origin, I think you said that you got the impression they're like interdimensional from the afterlife. How unambiguous or murky was that, the reception of that message? How sure are you that it was coming from something outside of you and not just your own thinking mind on its own accord?
So this is the hardest part of all this. And this is why discernment is really critical. I'll tell you more about the session that Dr. Nolan and I did. And so it began with questions like that, where this information is purely coming from within me. And you're absolutely right. If there's no way to validate that information, it's largely hearsay. So all I can do is relay this is what I told and try to be objective and independent as to what that is. Now, where things get more interesting with channeling is, Dr. Nolan was curious about how, the download process would work. Is that something that we can actually do and document with Gary's scientific background? I'm a liberal arts guy. I don't really have any scientific background, nor do I have a great deal of interest in it. And so to start, Gary wanted to give me a test question. And the question he gave me, and it's funny the way he phrased it, is I'm going to ask you something I know a great deal about and you know nothing about. And he asked me to explain how an exotic vacuum object works. And so over the course of, probably 10 to 15 minutes, I was able to draw out a schematic of what an exotic vacuum object is and how it functions best we can understand. And I show this to Gary, and he turns around his computer and shows an image of a schematic that looked, very similar, convincing enough for him that there was something to this. And then from there, we started to explore and push the boundaries of, looking at more challenging problems, like problems that have not been addressed by physicists. Things like the energy storage issue in a Casimir battery. That's one of the issues we tackled. And so, to your point, those channeled messages, they're interesting. There's hundreds of years of UFO channeled messages. There's the Urantia book, whatever this, IM material, set material, etc. All that's interesting, and it's, I guess it's entertaining to read, but you can't do much with that. And so that's where, this psionic asset element comes in once again, is that this is practical psi. Not so much that channeled information, but the fact that we can get reliable downloads is proof of non-local information, at least to myself.
So the biggest question I have more than anything here is I hear all of these, as I hear the story from James and, and I'm happy he's sharing, right? Absolutely. I just think, isn't this NHI like better at messaging, right? The messages are always so like cloak and dagger and like not very clear, right? Like that's what's so confusing about it. And they expect us to try to understand it and decipher it. You know what I mean? Because let's just break this down, akin to the afterlife. What does that mean to human beings when we hear that word afterlife, right? And did he hear it? He heard it in English, right? His own, like he's hearing it telepathically, regardless. Because afterlife in different languages, like it has a different meaning, right? So when you hear afterlife, what do you mean? Because to, let's say someone who's English speaking, it could mean a bazillion things, afterlife, right? We think, well, that's where you go when you die, but we have different explanations for that and different ideas of what that looks like, right? The afterlife, right? There's many different forms that the afterlife takes to humanity, depending on what religion, no religion, what you think. Everyone has different ideas of what that means, right? So for the NHI to use like language like that is confusing. It doesn't make sense, right? It's like it's almost something a human would say to another human, not a non-human to a human, right? Like even a human to a human, you'd want to explain, well, what do you mean by afterlife? What exactly are you talking about, right? Because is he implying that, they're us dead coming back, or they're some other beings coming back, right? Like they're in an afterlife. Like I just don't. I'm trying to wrap my head around it. Now I think at first, if you just hear that, you can jump to, they're heaven. They're talking about heaven. Oh, wait a second. Let's break this down a little bit, right? This is what I get so confused about with a lot of this. I just don't understand the messaging because we all use words differently, right? And the fact that the non-human intelligence isn't very careful of that and trying to explain, right? You figure they would show more than they would say. And if they did say, they would explain it a lot better than that, right? So I don't know. Maybe James is misinterpreting some of this stuff. How clear is he that that's the message he's getting, right? And there's no other source, right, to sort of, yeah, that's what I heard too, right? Does that make sense? It's like, you know what it is? It's like trying to listen to something that you can barely hear, right, on some headphones, and you're just really trying to listen in, but you need a few people to, you know what I mean, to really capture what it is that's being said. Like, I think I heard him say that. No, it sounded like this, like how clear is the messaging, right? Because that's confusing to use the term afterlife. I'm sorry, but to me, that is absolutely confusing, and that means something different to a lot of people. So how do they know we understand what that means? So I don't know, just asking questions. But look, Ryan from Post Disclosure World, who, first of all, hilarious that he's like typing, frantically while James is answering, which I've been there. You're just like taking notes and stuff. And Ryan's a great guy. I've had him on Vetted before. Really, really passionate guy. Again, I recommend checking out the full interview. And I'm glad he got this first ever, interview with this guy to put it out. So props to him and props to James for coming out. But, for me, it's just a little confusing, the messaging from this alleged non-human source. Now, I got one last clip for you of them talking about how exciting this is, right? And how mind-bending it is to hear that, right? This is going to come from Ryan. And again, but that's where it's hard for me to join in on that because, well, wait a second, let's define afterlife. What do we mean by this? What's mind-bending about it?
I find it particularly wild, the idea that the components or aspects of the phenomena, because like you said, we might be dealing with many different things, but part of it might have something to do with the afterlife. That is about as mind-bending as you could possibly ever get. I mean, to me, that's more mind-bending than I can't think of anything more mind-bending than that. If that's true, how is the world going to digest that?
I have no idea. I really don't know. And when we talked about Enya and the Explorers Club, I also have a startup background, and we joke about, when you're building a startup, you're kind of assembling the airplane while it's in flight. And I think burying our heads in the sand as to what this is and saying we shouldn't explore it because we don't understand it and the potential ontological shock for humans is too great, I think is grossly irresponsible. I tend to rail against, scientific materialism, but that really goes against, everything that we have been built on since the Enlightenment. I like to think that we're seeing a kind of commingling of different cycles of humanity, wherein previously, we were very superstitious, but these experiences were much more accepted. Move on to the Enlightenment, everything becomes scientific materialism. I think now we're going towards a synthesis of these two things, and it doesn't necessarily need religion as an explanation. It's okay for reality to be a lot stranger than we accept without necessarily having to just ascribe a label to it. But I do think, to your point about the afterlife, this is proof that we live on after death. And I can't think of anything more important than that, particularly, the hole that seems to exist in the West right now in terms of meaning, the crisis of meaning. And I do think the reality of our spiritual sides and the immortality of that, regardless of the paradigm one chooses to ascribe to it, that's what's so important here.
I mean, I hear what he's saying. It's going in one ear and it's staying there, but I just, I don't agree with that at all. This is not proof of us living on, forever, right? Immortality. Again, nothing's defined, right? And that's his interpretation, right? And seeing, I think that's the problem, right? Again, I'm so confused by the definition of afterlife, right? What that means. What are you saying? Proof of what? Right? So I hope that they're able to provide definitive proof on a global scale to scientists and get this proven. If this is real, then great. But until then, I'm definitely skeptical. I'm not ready to cross the finish line. Right? I'm not ready to celebrate until I cross the finish line. Let's put it that way. Right? Not going to start celebrating early. Yeah, this is proof of this, proof of that. Not really. Right? I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking about it wrong. It is interesting to think about. I see a lot of different ideas converging, and I do love the conversation and the topic. And to be honest with you, I would love to have James on and have that discussion, right, about this afterlife. Like, what exactly does that mean, right? Again, it's hard for me to get excited, or how is society going to respond to that? Well, they're not going to respond because that's not saying anything. You haven't defined really anything, right? There's a lot of assumptions there made. Right. So anyway, props to them. Again, link in the description. Go check it out. I love talking about this stuff. This is great discussion. This is how it should be had. And I think that's more important about this discussion than anything is that we have discussions, right? That's the best part about the discussion of the topic, is that we have the discussions, right? So anyway, all right, y'all, we'll see you guys in the next video. Remember, every day's a gift, y'all. Peace.
I live inside my own world of make-believe. Kids screaming in the cradles, profanities. I see the world through ice covered in ink and bleach. Cross out the ones who heard my cries and watched me weep.